Hello and welcome back. I'm Miss Patel, and I teach at Montgomery Blair High School in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm here today to talk to you about topic 4.2, political processes. So let's get into what we will learn today. Political geography changes over time, and therefore the current political map of the world is based on many political processes, including sovereignty, nation states, and self-determination. So we're going to look at each of these more specifically and look at some examples. Remember that the key skill here is to be able to look at a map or some geographic data about a specific example to use it to explain the political process more in-depthly. So the first term to know is sovereignty. This is the right of a state to rule over itself. So there's still sometimes countries added to the world even today. A lot of these examples you'll learn about throughout the rest of the Unit 4 videos. But for example, when a place becomes a state or a country, it's given sovereignty, such as the newest example in the world, South Sudan. So therefore, even the current political geography map can change at any point if there's a new state added and they're given sovereignty. Another key example and term is nation state. This is when the territory occupied by a particular nation of people is the same as the recognized political boundary of that state. There's no current state that's perfect with this in the world since there's been immigration and emigration over a long history, but there are some that come close. For example, Japan is a very close example of nation state. Because it was isolated for so long on its own island, it has its own language, and it's mainly the ethnicity of Japanese on Japan. They also didn't really encourage a ton of immigration for a long time. So this is a pretty close example to a nation state. Another common example that comes up that's a good one is Iceland. Same kind of thing. They were isolated for a long time. So same ethnicity, language, and history of one group of people in those political boundaries. All right, the last important term to know is self-determination. So this is when people have a right to govern themselves. This is often a nation or an ethnicity that wants to have its own state. There's a lot of examples of this, and they will be repeated a lot throughout these videos, but one would be the breaking up of Yugoslavia and the Balkans. I'm actually going to explain this one more in a second. And another thing that comes up a lot are all the stateless nation examples. This is a term that will be further defined, but it's basically when a nation believes that they should have their own state, but they're stuck inside another state, such as the Kurds, the Palestinians, the Basque, or the Catalans. I'm going to explain the Spanish examples in a second. So let's look at these more in depthly. Remember that some of these are complicated examples, so I can't explain every possible thing that happened, but I will summarize it. So one of the more complicated examples to know is the breaking up of Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia became a country because it combined together a bunch of existing nations. But eventually, several decades later, in 1991, that country collapsed. And it collapsed for many reasons that we'll get into, but it partially collapsed because each of those nations was searching for self-determination, to have its own nation and state to call home. This is such an important example to know that there's actually a term around it called balkanization, used to describe when a country splits into smaller countries. And it comes from Yugoslavia because this happened in the Balkans region. And obviously, when that happens, that greatly affects the current political geography of the world. Another key example would be in Spain. The Catalans and Basque people are two examples that are going to come up a lot because they both have a unique history, unique ethnicity and language, and have been fighting for their independence or at least a little bit more autonomy for a long time. So it's a good example of self-determination. This QR code sends you to a video that tells you a lot more about the situation in Catalonia. Let's practice this real quick with a multiple choice question. So this question says, which of the following best represents the concept of the nation state in its internal cultural political makeup? and spatial organization. This is a really common thing they do, and this is a very straightforward question, but you always need to know examples of each of these terms. So this is pretty much just asking you an example of nation state. So we should know from this video that the answer is Japan. So what should we take away from all of this? Political boundaries change over time and are affected by both historical and contemporary geography. Today's political boundaries are based on many political processes, including sovereignty, nation states, and self-determination. Knowing examples is very important, and being able to use a map or geographic data to explain that example is also super important. Remember to go out and find the good in the world, and thank you for listening. Hello and welcome back. I'm Ms. Patel, here to teach you today about topic 4.2, political processes. So, more specifically, just like last time, we will talk about how political geography changes over time, and therefore the current political map of the world is based on many political concepts and processes along national lines, such as things like colonialism, imperialism, independence movements, and devolution. So let's go into each of these a little more specifically. So the first major process to know is imperialism and colonialism. This is a huge political process that has many lasting effects all over the world in many different ways. There's a little bit of debate about how to define each of these, but for the most part, imperialism is considered to be the larger idea of creating an empire by exerting some kind of force over an area, potentially from afar, as in they may not go into that place and settle, unlike colonialism, where they actually practice claiming that territory, settling in that place, and exerting some kind of social and economic control. Unfortunately, there's a lot of examples of this in the world, since much of the European powers basically colonized most of the world. So Spain colonizing South America is one example, or the British colonizing South Asia, or the European powers sitting down for the Berlin Conference in sometimes what's called the Scramble for Africa, colonizing most of Africa. I'm going to go into some of those examples more in a little bit. The thing with all of this is this has lasting effects on all parts of life, including in today's political geography. For example, there might be cultural effects, such as Spanish being the main language in South America, or economic effects, as in there might be an economic dependency on a certain product or resource because of the European legacy in that place, or even worse, some kind of ethnic hatred or genocide, or some kind of political problem, like a government system that's ineffective or borders that mess up how people interact or different ethnic groups. So here's a map that's showing you the imperialism of 1914, and you can see how it covers most of the world. And this doesn't even include the Spanish Empire that had been kind of split up before this. So clearly this is going to have huge effects on the current political geography of the world. Another important term to know is independence movements. This is when a group of people in a particular part of a country are basically advocating to separate from that country for some particular reason, like ethnicity, religion, or maybe some kind of historical reason. One example of this is Catalonia, Spain. Another one is Scotland, UK. Both of these countries actually recently held referendums to ask about the people's opinion on independence. And there's a lot of other examples, including the Kurds from Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, which I'll explain later in this video. Sometimes there's also independence movements because the colonization in that area caused the people to want to rise against those colonizers and push for their own independence, such as the Indian independence movement against the British. So one more term, and then I'll go into more specific examples, is devolution. And this can be defined many different ways, but it's basically the breaking up of a state into smaller units, or the passing of power downward from the federal government to other more local governments. There's a ton of examples of these in the world. Some of them we're going to go into more as we go on. But in Spain, we've already talked about, in Yugoslavia, 2 different provinces in Canada, Belgium, and Nigeria. So a lot of this we'll get into more in other Unit 4 videos. But let's look at some more specific examples. One very important example to know is the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. It's sometimes called the Scramble for Africa, since the European colonizers basically just decided who was going to get what parts of Africa, which was clearly not their place to be, but this is what colonization is. So obviously, as things went on and they were able to some places were able to decolonize, it was maybe for different reasons. Maybe the colonizers left because they didn't have a use for that place anymore, or there was an independence movement, such as in Algeria or Kenya. Obviously, all of this has major lasting effects because sometimes cultures were destroyed, economies were destroyed, not to mention like new countries were made that completely ignored a lot of the ethnic divisions. And changes have been made since then. If we look at this map, there's a country, Rhodesia, on here that eventually became what is today Zimbabwe. So these continuously change throughout history depending on what happens. Another important example is India and the larger South Asia, where British colonized. This is an important example for several reasons. There was a huge independence movement in India led by Gandhi that was a push for them to get home rule for India. And by 1947, they gained independence. The British partitioned the area into this map that you see here, which is almost the same as today, except for East Pakistan on the right of the screen is now today Bangladesh. The reason they partitioned it this way was because there was a lot of massacres happening between Hindus and Muslims, and therefore they drew the lines based on where those majority religions already were living. So this still today is seen because Pakistan and Bangladesh continue to have a Muslim majority and India continues to have a Hindu majority. In that same country, there continues to be a major territorial dispute in the northern part in Kashmir, partially due to the fact that when a colonizing power draws these borders, there's just going to be disputes that happen because there might be ethnic groups that are put together that shouldn't be, or there was never an agreement about where that line should be since someone else drew the line. So still today, there's a lot of tension between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. You can scan that QR code to watch more about Kashmir. One great example of a group that's seeking separation with an independence movement is the Kurds. And this is an important one to know that comes up often. The Kurds are a unique ethnic group that live in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And they've been trying to get independence for a long time because they have a unique ethnicity, language, and culture. And the only country that's given them any kind of leeway is Iraq, who said, you know, you can have a little more autonomy. Every other country has denied them the wish to have their own state. So as the independence movements continue, potentially in our lifetime, we'll see a new country of Kurdistan, or maybe not. This is a great example of how it could change at any moment. So what should we take away from all of this? Historical and contemporary political processes both affect today's political boundaries. These processes include things like colonialism, imperialism, independence movements, and devolution. All of these can change political boundaries, and that affects almost everything else. Examples are very important here, especially being able to use a map, just like what I just did in a lot of this video. Some of the key examples are listed below, such as Spain, the Kurds, a lot of the colonization examples, such as Berlin Conference, South Asia, South America, and there's a ton of devolution examples that we'll get more into in the other videos, but some of them are listed here. Remember to go out and find the good in the world, and thank you for listening.